I'm Liz Copper and I'll be chairing the Hustings. Just to give you an idea of what's going to happen, there are 4 candidates here. Standing in the election will be Owen Patterson for the Conservative Party, Graeme Currie for Labour, Helen Morgan for the Liberal Democrats, John Adams for the Green Party, and a 5th candidate, Robert Jones, is standing for the Shropshire Party. Unfortunately, Mr Jones isn't able to be with us tonight. He sends his apologies. Now, what's happened in the last couple of minutes or so is that the candidates have pulled from a hat, they've drawn lots for the order in which they will speak, and they will give an address, a statement to you of up to 10 minutes where they'll explain a little bit about themselves and the reasons why they think you should vote for them. After that, we'll probably take a couple of questions, and then I think we'll have a short break where if anybody has some questions, they can drop them down on a little note. If you are too shy to ask a question, that's also fine. Drop them down on a note, and then that might be a question that I can ask on your behalf. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the candidates. First will be Helen Morgan from the Liberal Democrats. Then Graeme Currie for Labour. Owen Patterson for the Conservatives. And John Adams for the Green Party. So Helen, if you'd like to begin first.
Okay, good evening, thank you for coming. My name's Helen Morgan and I'm the Liberal Democrat candidate here. You probably recognise Owen and Graeme from last time, but I'm new to the fray, so I thought I'd start off with a little bit about myself and then explain why I think you should vote for me. So I'm a chartered accountant by profession, and I moved to North Shropshire a few years ago with my husband because we wanted to raise our son here. I'm here as a candidate because I really want to take a stand for the things that I value most, which are open-mindedness, tolerance, honesty, common sense, and our democracy. We've seen the 2 old parties of the past being overtaken by their extreme factions and the common sense centre ground of politics being vacated. So populism is the order of the day now. But populism feeds hate and division, and the simple solutions that it offers don't help to resolve the complex issues that our society faces. So I'm here to offer a different alternative, a common sense and pragmatic alternative for a brighter future. So that's a little bit about me. I'll move on to why I think you should vote for me. So obviously, I'm a Liberal Democrat. The first reason is stopping Brexit. The Conservatives and the Labour Party are starting this campaign, shaking their magic money tree, but the reality is that Brexit is likely to blow a £50 billion hole into the public finances over the next 5 years. It's simply not responsible government to take a sledgehammer to the economy with one hand and then borrow money willy-nilly with the other to try to buy off your voters. So we could end up in the unfortunate position where we spend more on interest repayments than we do on educating our children. A Liberal Democrat government will end this crippling uncertainty and stop Brexit on day one, and then use that £50 billion that we've saved to invest in public services and start to tackle the inequality that we face. Now, you might be thinking that £50 billion sounds like pie in the sky, but it has been assessed by the Institute for Fiscal Studies and called modest. So let's just move on a little bit. The Conservatives are offering Brexit, and it's a very extreme, hard Brexit. So much so that even Nigel Farage is happy with it. There's no Brexit Party candidate on the stage with us because of that, because in effect, we've already got one. The reality of Boris Johnson's Get Brexit Done deal is it doesn't get Brexit done, and it isn't a deal. Assuming that Parliament passes his withdrawal agreement, we've got 11 months to negotiate a proper trade and cooperation deal with the EU, which all 27 countries need to ratify individually, and in the case of Belgium, even their regional assemblies. It seems unlikely that that could be done in the timescale. So this time next year, we could be staring down the barrel of the no deal gun again and looking at medicine and fresh food shortages. Now, the government's own assessment said that there would be medicine shortages, and I don't know if you can imagine the stress of living with that for another year if it's your cousin or child who's insulin dependent. As for Labour, they're not really owning up as to what their Brexit position is, but it seems to me unlikely that they're going to go off to Europe and negotiate a deal and then campaign to remain. Brexit's a massive issue here because our major employers are in the farming and food industries, and they're likely to be the most severely hit by leaving the EU. So, for instance, a friend of mine is a sheep farmer. He breeds pedigree sheep and sells them into the EU. And at the moment, he's struggling to do that because of the uncertainty over Brexit. And he's likened the stress of that to that of the foot and mouth crisis, which we can all remember from 2001. There are farmers all across North Shropshire in that position. And ultimately, for what? The easiest way to stop this, to give our farmers and our businesses the certainty that they need, is to stop Brexit on day one. And that's what a Liberal Democrat government would do. But this election isn't just about Brexit, it's about who's going to govern the United Kingdom, if there is still a United Kingdom, for the next 5 years. And there are other key issues that we need to address. So I've put the NHS first on my list. Here in Shropshire, we can see firsthand what happens when you chronically underfund your NHS and starve it of key workers. The A&E waiting times released last week showed that we had the worst service in the country. And Brexit puts that at even greater risk. Donald Trump and his trade envoys have been clear that pharmaceutical companies, US pharmaceutical companies, want to charge the NHS more for their drugs. And that's a key issue in any trade deal. Boris Johnson says the NHS isn't up for sale, but Boris Johnson has said quite a lot of things that haven't turned out to be true. So you can Labour's maybe or maybe not Brexit, and then a top-down reorganisation of the NHS might result in some jobs for management consultants, but we're currently short of 40,000 nurses, and it's not really clear how they're going to pay for that. Added to which, pushing for a 4-day working week isn't going to help that chronic understaffing. But the Liberal Democrats will stop Brexit to retain our EU workers and plug some of that nursing gap, but also put a penny on income tax, and that money would be used to give the NHS the cash injection it desperately needs. We'll retain our EU nurses, we'll keep the NHS safe from Donald Trump, and we'll start to fill the massive number of vacancies that we have. In addition, we've got a capital fund to build the hospitals we need for the future, and in the longer term, there's a plan to bring health and social care together to iron out the gaps that a lot of people, especially older people, fall between at the moment. So next on the list is education. The public sector pay freeze has left our teachers demoralised, and the brutal cuts that we've had in North Shropshire have left our schools short of about £6.7 million since 2015. We'll reverse those cuts, and we plan to recruit 20,000 teachers over the next Parliament to reduce class sizes and give our children the start that they need. But we also need to look to the future. We can see firsthand here how the march of technology starts to threaten our traditional jobs. And I don't know, I went into a milking parlour recently where the cow just wandered in and did all the hard work itself. If we want our villages to thrive, we're going to need to retrain people with skills fit for the 21st century. And our £10,000 skills wallet for each adult will allow them to spend that money over their adult life to either retrain or keep their skills up to date. Speaking of moving on with the future, we also need to consider other essential broadband, and I have another B word, other essential technology, and I have another B word, and I've given it away already. It's broadband, not Brexit. I doubt anyone sitting here needs me to tell them that the broadband in Shropshire can be awful. I've just helped set up an office outside Priest, and I'm still bearing the scars of trying to get a high-speed broadband and 4 phone lines in there. We don't think, though, that Labour's plan of spending a lot of money nationalising that element of BT first is a sensible way to go about it. Our plan is to make sure that the existing providers meet their obligations to provide good local broadband and ensure that as technology progresses, those obligations are kept up to date. Another major problem here is affordable housing. While we were in this phone line broadband nightmare, I chatted with a BT engineer from Whitchurch, a highly skilled, full-time worker with a wife who worked full-time, and they couldn't afford a house, and they couldn't afford to save the deposit for a house because there's such bad housing shortage here. Our rural plan will require local councils to identify which houses they need in each area, and also to require developers to begin building a bigger ratio of affordable housing. So instead of building high-end homes in the wrong places, we'll get the homes that we need to help our villages retain the young working families that they need to thrive in the future. Last on the policy list is the climate emergency, last but definitely not least. The Conservatives don't really have a plan for the climate emergency, and the Labour Party have a plan for utilities renationalisation, which we think is a distraction from the climate emergency. The Liberal Democrats have a detailed and credible plan to become a world leader and to tackle this problem that we face. With our plans include banning fracking altogether and for good, and generating 80% of our electricity from renewables by 2030, as well as insulating the houses of people on low incomes by 2025. So that's a whistle-stop tour of our key policy areas, but now I'm just going to leave you with a few closing thoughts. We're faced with a choice at this election. We can choose extremism or pragmatism. We can choose populism or we can choose responsible government. You could vote Conservative, but it's a party that's completed its transition to the far right. It's been endorsed and appeased the Brexit Party and recently been endorsed by convicted criminal Tommy Robinson. Not only that, it's offering years and years of wrangling over trade negotiations to work out our future trading relationship with the world. You could vote Labour, but it seems to be a bit distracted by returning to the ideology of the 1970s. It's being investigated by the Equalities and Human Rights Commission over anti-Semitism, and it's not being honest about the most important issue to face this country since the Second World War. Alternatively, you can vote Liberal Democrat. We've got a plan to stop Brexit on day one and give businesses the certainty they crave. You'll get a government with credible, detailed and fully costed plans. We're going to spend that £50 billion bonus on our infrastructure and try and resolve the severe and complex issues we face in this country. So if you vote for me, you'll be voting for all of that, plus a fresh face for North Shropshire, and I think I have the honesty, the integrity and the energy to deliver a brighter future here. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Helen Morgan for the Liberal Democrats. Next, we're going to hear from Graeme Currie from the Labour Party.
Thanks. I'm going to do this as a straight introduction. I'm going to hopefully try and address some of those distortions and misinformation within the broad discussion later on. So let me introduce myself. Thank you for inviting me. I think it's a massive credit to Eric Davis because he's pulled this again together. I remember coming in 2015. I better say, yeah, I've been the candidate 3 times now, in 15, 17 and this year. As you might say, get a life, sad man, or you could say, 3rd time lucky, Graeme. Whichever one. But the reality is, I believe that what we need to have today is a discussion about what kind of society we want to live in. So, and that's what I aim to do in my introduction, and hopefully that's what we can have a productive conversation later. So, okay, I moved to Shropshire 15 years ago with my family, my wife and my 2 youngest children at the time. They're still my children, and she's still my wife. I came from Manchester. I love living in Shropshire. I live in Bagley, the other side of Ellesmere, if you know it. Everybody does know Bagley because it used to be... I thought it was mine then, sorry. There's a pub in Bagley called The Fox, and it's not been open for about 15 years, and everybody says, about 20 years, more like 25, and everybody says, oh yeah, you know The Fox? And I say, no, I've only been there 15 years. So when I came to Shropshire, I worked for Shropshire Council. I came here as I'm a social worker by trade, and I came here working on a very innovative project that was about developing joined up services between health and social care. And I actually was employed by the council, but I worked in what was the Primary Care Trust. I did that job until 2011, when, if you remember, the austerity agenda came in. Sadly, that team evaporated as the budgets ran for the hills. I became redundant. I now set up my own company. I work as I have a little social work company. I work for local authorities across the West Midlands. I work for the Ministry of Justice, and I also do some work within the university sector. So that's kind of my background. I used to be I spent 9 years as a local authority councillor in Oldham, so I've got some experience in local government. What I want to talk about is that this election isn't just a Brexit election. We're going to talk about Brexit, I'm sure, but this election is about more than that. This is an election about potentially how we transform the economy of Britain for the benefit of all, not just for the very small few. And this isn't an election for cliches, but this is what this election is going to be about. The Labour Party policy, and what I'm going to be fighting for, is at the end of austerity, a properly funded NHS and public services, to revitalise the economy, work to end the climate emergency, and offer people a way through the Brexit chaos. The Labour Party have got the only solution. What we've had, it's clear the Tories have had 3 years to sort this mess out, and they've failed. Just so you can get a clear picture, I voted Remain in 2016. I stood on the Labour Party manifesto in 2017. We didn't have a Hustings in 17, because I think the Manchester bombing sadly prevented it, but I remember we had one here in 15. But I stood on the manifesto in 17 to deliver that Brexit. The Tories have absolutely caused the most toxic, divisive culture that our society's ever known. And what the Labour Party can offer now is the only way forward that can try and bring Remainers and Leavers together. What we will do after 3 months of a Labour government, we will move. I look forward to explaining the Labour Party position, but we've got the only way forward. We've not got the extremes of this far-right Brexit that's going to be totally destructive to the economy and our future. Or we've got this other extreme of the Lib Dems, where they're just going to turn it off like that. We've got a way through, which is by negotiating a deal that's good for the economy, good for the people, and then putting it back to the people within 6 months. That's the way forward. The decade of austerity that we've had must come to an end. It's been demonstrated that public services are not safe in the Tories' hands. It's clear that we've seen the cuts in local government, the NHS, the fire service, the police, and the absurdity that we've got people the Prime Minister talking about replacing 20,000 police. He's the one who got rid of those police. So we're in a situation where we need to have an honest debate. Talking about honest debate, I know this is another sad man thing. I tried to do a little list of Boris Johnson's lies. I didn't have a piece of paper big enough. I've got a piece of A4 here, but it wasn't big enough. What we've seen in Shropshire, there was a report that's just gone to Shropshire Council. Let me just check where I'm at. There was a report that's just gone to Shropshire Council that was produced by a group of churches, voluntary sector organisations, Age UK, and some academics. And it's describing that 1 in 5 children in Shropshire, our Shropshire, are living in poverty. We've got a situation where we've seen £40 million worth of cuts in the education budget in the last 5 years. And that's the impact on our children. We've seen a social care budget that's been tens of millions of social care budget in Shropshire has been disappeared in the last 10 years. We've got to address these issues. The NHS, let's come to the NHS, the Future Fit agenda is just a fig leaf for a cuts agenda. And let me be clear, we've got to look at what this means for us. I'm going to speak from personal experience here. We've got 2 A&Es. In 2010, my daughter was hit by a car in Baschurch. She died twice in the ambulance. It was only the skill and the expertise of the paramedics in that ambulance that saved her. I don't believe she'd have made it. She went to RSH, and she's an inspiration to us all now, my daughter. I don't believe she'd have made it up the M54 to PRH. I don't believe she would. We've got to fight to defend the services we've got, whether it's phoning up to get a GP and realising it's going to take you 2 weeks, or wanting to save your own daughter's life. These are the extremes that we've got to look at in terms of saving our NHS. Defending it, I'm there with Helen, defending it from clearly the Trump trade deal that's been lined up. We can talk about that later, because there's some good examples of how that works, using our own representative going to America to talk about how that's going to operate. I'm going to move on quickly because I think I've got 10 minutes, haven't I? I've got 2 minutes to go. So what I'm going to come back to is a key part of Labour's revitalisation of the economy, changing it from an economy that's about making money for itself to an economy that's based on production and productivity and social equality for all. We're going to drive that. One of the key drivers is going to be the way that we deal with climate change, the climate emergency. We're going to set a new Green Deal that's potentially going to establish up to 400,000 new jobs, 320,000 apprenticeships. We're going to have a develop the economy in a way that we've not seen before, and that's going to be funded by a fully costed manifesto that will come out tomorrow. What we've got is a plan to deal with. I was looking at this. I've worked out that I pay more corporation tax than Amazon, which isn't hard because they don't pay anything. They don't pay anything. If you work for Amazon, you'd have to work for 24 hours a day for 68 years on the minimum wage to earn what Jeff Bezos earns in 1 hour. So it's time for us to address this. The corporate tax dodgers. We're going to have a situation where the economy is going to be changed to make it much fairer for all. And we're getting on. 1 minute to go. I've got 20 seconds. So what I want to say now is we're going to put people first. I want to remind you that it's a 2-horse race in Shropshire. In 2017, the Lib Dems came just about with 5% of the vote. Labour got 17,000 people voted Labour. We're in a situation here where it's a 2-horse race. The Greens sadly lost their deposit. So what you need to do is think what the alternatives are. If you want to have a new voice for Shropshire and a voice that's going to be representing local people, accessible, I would intend to ensure that I had constituency offices in both parts of in Drayton and Oswestry. I would also, as concluding remarks, I've put a press release out today that I've asked all the other candidates to commit to. I've committed that if I was elected as your MP, I would only have one job. There would not be any other. I wouldn't have time for any other jobs to represent or work for anyone else. I would only work for the people of Shropshire. And that press release has gone out today. It's in the Shropshire Star. It's online, and I've publicised it. And I'd like you to all take the time to have a look at it and read some of the information on that. So, as I come to a conclusion, what I'm hoping we can have is a productive conversation that's based on facts. not based on misrepresentation. So please, it's really great to have been invited here tonight. Thank you, vote Labour.
Third up this evening is Owen Patterson for the Conservative Party.
Thank you very much. Can I begin by thanking everybody who has organised this evening and all of you for coming on a wet, cold, nasty night. I'll begin by saying a few comments about myself, because some of you may not have been here at the previous 6 elections when I've stood as the candidate in North Shropshire. I was born in Whitchurch a long time ago, 1956, and I spent the first 20 years of my life having been a farming and tanning background. I worked in a tanning business and took it from 15% export to 95% export. And perhaps relevant to later discussions, I also became president of the European Tanners Confederation, in which I ran the meetings in French and translated for the Germans when they couldn't keep up. And we turned out a very strong free trading organisation, and I brought in non-EU countries at the time, Switzerland, Norway and Liechtenstein. So I then elected just in 1997 in the Great Blair landslide, and I have been your MP since. And one of the subjects which has been a running thread has been who runs the country. Is it elected members of Parliament, or is it unelected officials in a supranational organisation? And having walked around Drayton this morning, being accosted by numerous people, the overwhelming issue in Drayton was the issue of Brexit. People are absolutely fed up with the uncertainty. They are fed up with having voted with the 17.4 million. We voted to leave, and we have been thwarted. And there is a long record of why they should be fed up. David Cameron said, if you vote Conservative in 2015, we will give you a one-off referendum. In or out, whatever you decide, it'll be decisive. To his surprise, perhaps he won and delivered a referendum. During the course of the bill that took it through, I remember Philip Hammond saying absolutely clearly, we the MPs, we will give you the decision. We're currently sovereign, we will make you sovereign. You will decide. Whatever you, the people, decide, we will honour as a parliament. We then had the leaflet that went around, bombarding all with propaganda not to leave, which was ignored. And despite all that, 17.4 million people voted to leave. The biggest vote in British history ever on any one subject. We then had the subsequent election, in which the Tory manifesto made it very clear that we would honour the vote, and we would leave the single market, we would leave the customs union, we would leave the remit of the European Court of Justice. And hopefully, on page 36, it said no deal is better than a bad deal. And the Labour Party also at that time, it's worth reminding everyone, endorsed leaving and said they would honour the vote. So 85% of the votes at the last election were to leave. And what has happened since has been a disgrace, because you've had a collision between direct democracy, where we've had about 11 referendums in recent years. Go back to 1975, we've had the Welsh, Irish, Scottish, we had the AV referendum. Each time, the people politely and obediently went along with what the establishment wanted. This time, we have this terrible collision that the people did not do what the establishment wanted. Both the political establishment in the Commons and the Lords, the commercial establishment represented by organisations like the CBI, as we know, certainly the media establishment, and we've seen, tragically, I think, revealed the judicial establishment. So it is now a matter of absolute key principle in our democracy. We may never, ever, ever have another referendum again after this. That may not happen. But the people were told, your decision will be honoured. And the only way now at this election to see that decision honoured is to vote Conservative. Because Boris Johnson has secured a deal. We would leave on the 31st of January, we'd leave the political institutions, and as Helen said, we would have a year to negotiate a free trade agreement. And my bet is that given that the European Union has nearly 100 billion surplus with us, we have zero tariffs, we have totally conforming regulation, this is absolutely doable. But if they are so idiotic and pig-headed as not to agree a free trade agreement, we can leave on World Trade Organization terms with a whole number of side deals which have already been agreed. We've done it on aviation, we've done it on drivers, we've done it on live animals, and Don't worry, the insulin and the animals will move. We trade with the vast majority of the world on World Trade Organization terms, but we shouldn't come to that. We should be looking to do a free trade agreement, and that should happen. But we should not exaggerate too much the value. The European Union, or the European continent, has only one other continent with a slower rate of growth. That's Antarctica. 8% of UK businesses sell to the European Union. In goods, worth GDP, that's 8.2%. In services, it's 5.5%. The growth is outside. Overwhelmingly, our sales to the rest of the world is where the future is. So it is absolutely vital, both politically, that we honour the vote. It is absolutely vital, both economically, we honour the vote. And we will fly. I went to the new tractor business, agricultural goods business today, KO machines. They're doing well at the moment, but they know that once we leave, the economy will really fly. Agriculture around here will really take off. We'll be able to embrace all the latest technologies. We can have an agricultural policy and an environment policy tailored to our own industry and our own environment. I am absolutely clear that the real growth will come once we leave. People are definitely holding back. This uncertainty is bad, and the way to end it is to vote Conservative. And that will then release money for all the good things we would really like to be talking about in a normal election. You take health. I really don't agree with Graeme. It's impossible to say that putting 312 million into FutureFit, the biggest investment by the state in Shropshire ever, is a cut. That is a nonsense. What we've seen is we've had this pillow fight between Shrewsbury and Telford, with very, very unhelpful intervention using public money on judicial reviews by Telford and Region Council, which has held the project up. We could have had the new trauma centre up and running by now. Lives could have been saved by it if we hadn't had this delay. This will bring skills back into the county. You'll no longer have to go in a helicopter if you have a bad stroke or a heart attack. This will massively enhance healthcare in Shropshire, and I've been very much behind it. And Matt Hancock has been tremendous pushing this through. It is vital you vote Conservative to make sure this happens, so there is no more delay. If you look at other areas of activity, yes, there have been reductions, but don't forget the mess the last Labour government made of the economy. We were borrowing £300,000 a minute. That is the measure of the mess Blair and Brown made of the economy. It has taken some time to correct that, and with the Liberals in the coalition and our own recently in minority government, we've had a very tricky balance, continuing to deliver public services, continuing to increase on health actually, and in other areas, but having to make severe reductions. We know that. We know how difficult it's been in local government and police. And at last, we can begin to build up. So if you look at the latest formulas for local government spending, for education spending, at last, we are beginning to increase and correct the imbalance between rural spending and urban spending, which is a long, long-running battle, which we may come to later. And if you look at other services, we touched on police, we're going to see 50 more policemen here. That is part of the 20,000. Yes, we've dipped, we've come to the bottom of the dip, now we can build back up again. But we can only do that if we keep a strong economy. We look at other areas of investment. Communications are really vital around here. We are 200 miles from London. We are an hour and a half from the centre of Birmingham. We need good communications. And on my longest running campaign is the A5 and the A483 Patterson bypass. It's less relevant to you living here in Drayton, but we've set up this group involving Shropshire Council, Midlands Connect, Highways Agency, and at last we're beginning to make real progress, working closely with the Welsh Government on that. And locally here, I've set up a similar group looking at A41, which is becoming increasingly busy and increasingly dangerous. And I've asked every parish council to start collating data on every tiny incident. I very much hope you all contribute to that. And then, even more locally, we have an opportunity with the changes in defence accommodation, with the Royal Irish sadly moving out in a few years' time. We have a great opportunity to develop Turnhill. And I've set up the Turnhill Task Force to look at how we can really make that an asset and really enhance not just the economy, but the whole life of this area. So it's a massive bonus for the economy and the life around Market Drayton, and enhances actually the whole of North Shropshire. Because a site like that, 60 hectares, is only going to come up once in our lifetime. But it's really important we all work together to see that that is developed well. Looking at my watch, I think I'm very nearly at the end of my time. I would just like to say one last thing. None of these good things I've just talked about will happen unless we run the economy competently. We've never had a Labour government that has left with unemployment lower. Every Labour government has left with unemployment higher. The economies most admired by Jeremy Corbyn are East Germany and Venezuela, and the most crude judge of how bad they were is that life expectancy went down in those countries. So it really is important to keep the economy strong, to pay for our public services, to vote Conservative, to end the endless uncertainty about Brexit, get it done so we can move on. Thank you very much.
And last but not least, with his statement, is John Adams from the Green Party.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I'm John Adams, the Green parliamentary candidate for North Shropshire. I've lived in North Shropshire since 1987. Came up here to study at Harper Adams University College, as it was then, when they first started doing the degree course in agriculture. Family and children got a little bit in the way of that, but eventually managed to complete the degree with Open University. I did work at Harper Adams for over 20 years until last year, and I'm particularly interested in things like sustainable development and the climate emergency that we've got now. So tonight I'm going to ask you to cause a bit of a political earthquake in North Shropshire on December the 12th. Not because I'm desperate for power and publicity, but because actually it is the right thing to do at this particular time. So my aim tonight is to persuade you to change what you think is possible, basically to persuade you to vote for a Green MP in North Shropshire. And for all our sakes, this election really must be the climate election. The climate emergency is the defining issue of our time, and it's far more important actually in terms of our future well-being and how it's going to impact on that even than Brexit is. Climate change is actually going to have a negative impact on every aspect of our life. Whatever the issues locally that really mean a lot to you, they're all going to be affected in some way by climate change. And it doesn't matter how fast we act to reverse it, there's still going to be significant impacts. But if we do manage to change what we think is possible, then we can actually still act fast enough to prevent catastrophic impacts from affecting us all. And Brexit actually is going to make that task even harder, especially if we go the way that Owen would have us go. So during questions later on, hopefully, I'll have a chance to persuade you that the Green position on Brexit does actually provide the most sensible way to settle the issue of Brexit and to move on. But I'm not going to dwell on that just now, because I realise that this constituency has actually elected Owen Patterson to be its MP for 22 years, and I think that's too long.
Yeah.
But because of that, of course, I do realise that asking you to vote Green is actually a bit of a challenge. So why should you stand with the Green Party and vote to do something very different this time? Well, the Green Party is actually very different to the other parties in lots of ways. There's very different values, for example, as a basis for policy making. But I'd like you to think just for a minute. Each of you probably have very different pictures, but to think about how you see the world today, just for a moment. And then to ask yourself, how does that picture actually compare with the world that you would like to be seeing? And I'm guessing that there would be two very different worlds in your mind. But that seems to me where we are today. We're kind of at a crossroads where we've really got to make a decision, and it's got to be the right decision for our children and for our future. So the Green Party's road is one of the roads that we can choose to take, and that's the road to a safe, fair and hopeful future. And you could choose to take the other road, which our politicians are currently leading us down, which is the road to nowhere very pleasant. And if we continue with politics as usual, then it seems to me that the future surely is going to be more of a downward spiral, further environmental, social and economic breakdown in society. So the Green Party thinks it's time for us to take a different road towards a very different future. And it didn't need to be the way it is, because we're only at this crossroads now because our politicians haven't been honest with the public. And that is a real major problem, especially for this election. If we don't even know when we're being lied to, how on earth are we supposed to make the right decision and decide who to vote for in the general election? So successive governments are sort of responsible. They haven't been brave enough to challenge powerful and wealthy interests who are determined to continue with business as usual. They haven't listened to the science and implemented policies that are needed to keep us safe. And they should have started the transition to a fossil-free world 20 years ago. Fortunately, the Green Party, I nearly said the Brexit Party, the Green Party has done the homework. And it's the only party that's ready with credible policies that are appropriate for this critical moment in human history. Although it's obviously the Green Party is not going to form the next government, it's really, really important to maximise the number of Green MPs in Parliament. So this is the opportunity for you guys to convince the next government that adopting the transformational green policies that we're offering can actually reward them politically. They are kind of pretending to adopt our clothes, whether they're over here or over here, but we really need to get them to bite the bullet and adopt more of our policies in a much more realistic way. So if we had more MPs in Parliament, those votes for those Green MPs, especially if it's quite likely it turns out there's no overall majority, that could make all the difference to the future. So I feel a huge responsibility, particularly to challenge Owen Patterson, because I'm convinced the policies he's promoting will take us down that wrong road, and they're completely inadequate for a time of climate emergency. And his decision, I think, to not appear at the Oswestry Environment Hustings on the 4th of December speaks volumes about his lack of concern for the environment. Does he really feel so safe that he can afford to ignore any voters who care about the planet? But the Green Party is actually offering voters very carefully considered and costed policies under the banner of a Green New Deal to transform the unsustainable economy we have today, to reverse climate change and environmental damage, while at the same time creating a fair and just society. And that Green New Deal aims to create over 4 million jobs by 2030. In transport, we're going to upgrade, if we did get into power, we would upgrade the rail capacity, be new buses, cycleways and footpaths. In industry, there'll be money for research and development on decarbonisation and skills training and things like that. In housing, we'll be building 100,000 new zero-carbon social homes per year, insulating all the houses in the country that need it by 2030, and retrofitting, putting in much more renewable heating systems into 1 million homes per year for the next 10 years. In energy as well, by doubling the capacity of the grid and investing heavily in renewables, and in agriculture and forestry by doubling the woodland area from 26%, to 26% from 13%, and also starting transition to sustainable farming. And those policies are well worth looking into in more detail in the Green Party manifesto that was launched yesterday. And you can see that at policy.greenparty.org.uk. That's policy.greenparty.org.uk. So please do read that. There's an awful lot of interesting detail in there. So the Green Party believes that the climate emergency really must be the overwhelming priority for the next government. The public hasn't been told the truth about climate change, and the Green Party is the only party that's mature enough to tell it like it is, to borrow a phrase from Greta Thunberg. Science tells us that humans are actually changing the climate faster than nature has before. And this rapid change is a real threat to the future of human civilization. Half of humanity's carbon emissions have occurred in the last 30 years, and it's estimated that the wealthiest 10% of the world's population are responsible for 50% of the annual global emissions. Climate change doesn't have any political affiliation, and it's going to affect everyone on Earth. So we all need to come together right now, like we did in World War II, in fact, and act collectively for the common good. Of course, there are people who don't want you to believe that there's a climate emergency out there. They can't deny the overwhelming scientific agreement about it anymore, but they certainly will claim it's impossible or it's too expensive to make the necessary changes without destroying the economy. We think they're wrong.
John, you have had 10 minutes, so if you can just have your closing remarks now.
Okay, basically there's no time to wait another 5 years before deciding to change course. We need to change course now, so every voter, every one of you is extremely powerful, has a powerful voice to express in this election to determine the kind of world that we'll experience in the future. Thank you.
Thank you to all the candidates for their statements. I'm now going to take a couple of questions, and maybe if we can bring the house lights up so we can, if that's possible, so we can see who's in the audience. So we do have a roving mic that can come and find you. Perfect. Okay. Now, is Matt's tuber here? I think Matt is here. Now, I should say that these questions have been submitted in advance, but the candidates have no knowledge of them. They've not had sight of them. So, Matt, if you could ask your question, please.
In Shropshire, what do you think is the area that's most going to be affected by Brexit? And what do you think is going to happen with the pressure that's already tremendous on the school system within Shropshire?
Okay. Matt, do you mind me asking how old you are?
I'm actually 16. I'm not going to vote in the general election coming up, but I'm really into politics, and I'm really interested.
Yeah, so prospective young voters. So I have a this question is, what do you believe Brexit will affect most in North Shropshire, especially do you think it will affect the school system? And if we can start, I think, with Graeme Currie for Labour on that question.
Is this working, yeah? It's going to affect every aspect of our lives. I mean, we've got to be careful here because we're not redoing the Brexit debate. The offer from Labour is that we're going to look at producing a deal that's going to be less destructive than the current deal that Owen's talking about. Owen's talking about a Brexit deal. It's interesting that he makes reference to Cameron not expecting. Let's put this all in context. This is a Cornwall's moment for the Tory party. The Tory party has been tearing itself apart over Europe for the last 30 or 40 years, probably a lot longer than that. The reality is that Brexit is a symptom of the global financial crisis and the fact that the communities left behind. And that debate that happened was full of slogans. We know that it was full of lies. Both the Leave organisations were subject to criminal acts. But we're in a situation now where we need to find a way forward that's going to be a Brexit that has links to the customs union and the single market, gets us out of an offer that would be removal from the political union but maintaining the economic benefits. Right now, we've got the economic benefits. What we'd lose in Shropshire is the opportunity for you to travel and work abroad. I think we need to address the agricultural industry in Shropshire. This is a really, really important point. The reality is, if you look at what the National Farmers Union, if we're going to describe them as the establishment, so be it. The National Farmers Union has very, very strongly come out against Brexit from the very beginning. The reality is, Owen presents, because I've heard him, you see, in previous hustings, so I know what his position is. His position is something that he's described it as the New Zealand version. He doesn't believe that there should be subsidies to farmers. He believes that we should have a situation where CAP ends, there's no subsidy to farmers. We'd have a situation where we'd be flooded with cheap food. The farming industry, the dairy, the sheep, the Green Party would have a lovely time because we'd be rewilding Shropshire within 10-15 years because the sheep industry, the dairy industry and the arable industry would be decimated by cheap imports of food from, well, we don't want to get into the issues of the American trade deals that could happen. Would be the other impact would be economically. What we've been offered is a series of slogans that have led to nothing. We've got to remind ourselves that actually Theresa May's withdrawal agreement was voted down by the Tories as well. The ERG, the Spartans, the extreme Brexiteers, as Owen owns the term, the goggle-eyed Brexiteers, voted against the withdrawal agreement. That's why we're in the state we're in now. It's happy to blame the Labour Party, but it's actually, this has all been about a split in the Tory party. So the impact economically on Shropshire would be devastation of the agriculture industry, a contraction of the economy which has been estimated at between 8 and 12% within 5 years. So we'd be in a situation where major infrastructure within Shropshire would be impacted. Public sector and the private sector would be impacted equally because we'd have a constriction of the economy. So it would be devastating for agriculture in North Shropshire and devastating for the prospects of young people and devastating for local business and the economy. I'm going to leave it there and come back to that later, hopefully.
I'm going to bring in Helen Morgan from the Lib Dems on that question, just to remind you, it's about what area you believe Brexit will affect most in North Shropshire.
Well, I think there are two key issues to consider here. Firstly, there's the direct impact on our major employers. So North Shropshire, we're highly dependent on farming, but also on the food industry. And those are the two areas that are most severely impacted because if we end up doing, as Owen described, we've got zero tariff protection for goods coming into the country. So that's agricultural produce from elsewhere in the world. But exports going out, and while growth may be high from a low base with the rest of the world, the vast chunk of our exports still go to the EU. We're talking about tariffs of about 68% on beef, I think 35% on cheese, which obviously has an impact on the dairy industry and the dairy producers here, right here. So I don't need to repeat what Graeme said. The NFU have said the worst kind of Brexit would lead to about 50% of our farms going out of business. So that's the kind of the economic impact directly here on our jobs. But secondly, there's a knock-on impact because any kind of Brexit, I mean, Graeme's just said it, the Labour version is just like not as bad as the Tory version. Well, I don't think we should accept second best.
Not subject to a confirmatory referendum within 6 months.
Well, fine, but if you've negotiated a deal, you're probably going to argue that it was a good one. So it's a second best option. It's a second best option for our country. It's 6 months more of uncertainty even if we ended up remaining. And I think that we should be more ambitious than that and actually go for the best possible outcome. And at the moment, we're a member of the EU and we have the best deal any country in the EU. We could call it a Germany Plus. We've got the access to everything the EU offers. We have a rebate. We don't have to join the euro. We're not in the Schengen area. We have all the benefits of all those things. 500 million inquiries into the criminal database a year, for example. So I think we should go for the best deal that we've got because of the direct impact on our jobs, but also because the next biggest employer in this area is the public sector. And if we are swinging at our economy by making it smaller than it needs to be, we're reducing the amount of tax receipts to spend on the public sector. We're talking about very high levels of joblessness, particularly away from the southeast, where more and more people are employed in the public sector. So that's why I think Brexit is particularly bad for North Shropshire. And just coming on to your question about education, there may well be less money to spend on teachers and schools. It's difficult to say because we're a little bit hypothetical in the future. But in terms of further education, there's a big knock-on effect because we lose access to all those European projects that currently students can benefit from. So the Erasmus project is just one that I can think of off the top of my head, but there are several. Now the reality is, rich people will still be able to go and study in Europe, but those opportunities will diminish for young people without rich parents, and that's not right. At the moment, we've got those equal opportunities to go and study anywhere in Europe, and to bring the best academics here, to raise our educational standards here. And we don't want to lose that either, in my view.
Owen, Patterson, how are you addressing that question?
Well, I see tremendous opportunities for this country once we leave the European Union. There's quite a lot about farming, and start with that, because that's obviously critical around here, as is food production. We've been held back by the CAP reforms, which of course I was in charge of actually, representing the UK. We were consistently outvoted. We had ludicrous things like the rotation system at the moment imposed upon us, which we knew at the time would be damaging to our industry. Our self-sufficiency in food has fallen while we've been within the CAP. We'll be able to devise our own farming policy, tailored to our own industry and our own environment. Graeme picks up my enthusiasm for what happened in New Zealand. Half of it's correct. There isn't a single farmer in New Zealand that would go back to being subsidised. They were very, very heavily subsidised.
Because they had clearances happen, that's why. All is left is big aggro, that's all.
Let me just finish the sentence. As an example, they had 70 million woolly, raggedy, shaggy things running around the hills, doing terrible damage to the environment, ruining watercourses, causing soil pollution, called sheep. They were paid for by a headage payment. The Labour government at the time in New Zealand ran out of money, and it was absolutely brutal. They stopped subsidies literally overnight. There were no subsidies at all, and they had to adjust very rapidly. They now have an incredibly productive sheep industry. With a little over 20 million sheep, they're exporting the same amount of lamb. Now, we can replicate that. I went to a guy near Pikes End, just out by Cockshires, who is bringing in genetic strains from New Zealand. His sheep are 20% more efficient than some of the current strains that the farms he's selling to. So there are massive opportunities to improve the productivity of farming. And, this is where an enormous but comes into the sentence, which Graeme missed, we can, within WTO rules, continue to support our farmers with environmental payments. We can pay for biodiversity. We can pay for improved soils. We can pay for handling of water. We could, if we wanted, pay for animal welfare. British public have a huge high regard for animal welfare, and that is something which is a public good for which there is currently no market mechanism to compensate. So if you look what happened with John Gummer, he brought in unilaterally tethers and stalls in the pig industry. There was no increase in pig welfare at all because the pig industry closed down in the UK and he moved off to Holland and Denmark. We, as an independent nation within with our own control of our own laws, could tailor these laws in such a manner as to deliver what the public wants and help the farming industry, which is also WTO compliant. So I see massive opportunities once we leave. I see growth opportunities abroad. We have 1 billion people this evening. 1 billion people are hungry. That is shocking. We're about to add 2 billion more people to the world. There is a huge increase in wealth in Asia, a massive increase in demand for proteins. And I saw this when I was doing DEFRA. I led more delegations, I think, large delegations to foreign food trade shows than any preceding Secretary of State. There are monster opportunities. So, and, you know, K Machines today, he's doing well at the moment. He's really looking forward to leaving the EU and seeing farming boom around here because he's going to sell more farm machinery. Now, your question also, you touched on schools, which I thought was interesting. The most obvious benefit to schools is that we will have a faster growing economy. The Cardiff School of Economics says we'll have a 4% growth. We'll have 60 billion for public services if we leave the EU properly. We will see a big improvement in people's home budgets, probably worth about £300 a year, if you reduce costs of food and we reduce costs of clothing imports, because we'll be no longer paying artificial tariffs to the EU. And so there will be, I hope, more money for Shropshire schools. And then I think it's a very important element which we haven't touched on, which is immigration. Currently, at the current level of immigration, Shelter reckons we need to build a new home every 2 minutes. Now that could explain why there is tremendous pressure on housing. One of the earlier speakers touched on it. It is really shocking that the young generation cannot now buy houses because they've been excluded, because there's been such an increase in demand. We haven't managed to match supply. What we will be able to do is to manage immigration so we have the right skills in the right areas. Now that might mean people who pick potatoes, it might mean people who work as eye surgeons, but we will have a choice across the world. We won't just be limited to letting in everybody on free admission from the EU. We'll have to exclude possibly more skilled people from outside. So I think that could benefit schools. And then I think what we've seen in Shropshire schools, I think it would be remarkable that where they have absorbed children from very different backgrounds. I went to a school, Oswestry, 30% of the children didn't speak English as a first language. Now, with that, with a more measured immigration, and I think we can steady, I wouldn't put a number on it because everyone's always looking for numbers on immigration, but we will stop this unrelenting pressure. It is just not, I just don't think it's credible we can go on the pressure on public services at the level we are at the moment when Shelter's saying it's going to be a new home every 2 minutes. So very briefly, I think there will be more money. We'll have a better range of people coming in who we can tailor to our country, and we can slow down and live in the actual numbers. So hopefully we can get the housing supply up and match it and get housing costs down. Because that is a real problem for your generation. It's really bad that you will be excluded from buying a house. It's really, really bad, and we've got to balance that up. So it's a question of reducing demand and increasing supply.
Can I just say, I don't think it's appropriate to say that we need to build a house every minute for an immigrant. I think that's really irresponsible.
I deliberately quoted Shelter, which is a very respected charity, which says at the current rates we need to provide a new home every 2 minutes for the increasing population. Simple as that.
No, it's not. That's misrepresentation of the facts, isn't it?
That's racist. That is pure and simple racist.
I'm terribly sorry. No, I'm terribly sorry. Shelter is not a racist organisation. They're very racist.
I'm going to bring in John Adams now.
That is actually slanderous. No, I'm sorry. I'm not tolerating that. Good. I spent my career. Now, before you start shouting at me, I won't tolerate people using slander in a public meeting. I spent my life flying around the world, talking to people in other countries, often in their own languages. I am completely, totally colourblind. And I would like you to withdraw that comment, please.
Yeah, can withdraw it.
Will you please withdraw it?
Right. What I shall say then is this. You are not looking at building houses 1 minute for immigrants who are not in the EU. correct that if I'm wrong, and I shall say you're not racist. What is that?
I quoted a well-respected charity, Shelter, who said publicly that if we maintain the current levels of immigration and the population requirements be that we need to provide a new home every 2 minutes. That cannot be racist.
Can I make a point of clarification? Just on that statistic. Just trying to have a little Google to find the statistic. There is a Shelter report which says that 5 families are made homeless every hour. I can't find any reference to immigration. I think, again, I would be interested to see if Mr. Patterson can find that statistic, the statistic and the relation to immigration, because that doesn't seem to be actually true, is what I would point out. It's nice that he shares his leader's tendencies to be economical with the truth, but I think it would be good to get that particular point straight, Mr. Patterson. And I think what you'll see is that the Tories have been building houses at the lowest speed since the Second World War.
Absolutely.
It is the lack of investment that is the reason for our housing crisis, not immigration.
What I'm going to do now is return to Max's question. Most in North Shropshire, especially with regard to the school system, and we're going to hear from John Adams from the Green Party on that question.
Like everywhere else, Brexit obviously is going to mean job losses, end of freedom of movement for sectors that rely on workers being able to come here as needed, less protections for the environment, but I think mainly, again, as it's going to affect all areas, that Brexit is actually, at this particular time, a very big distraction from enabling us to deal increasingly at a local level, because the Green Party wants to empower local councils, local authorities to do an awful lot more towards transforming the economy and society in order to reverse climate change, and that's going to be made an awful lot more difficult by the kind of hard Brexit that the Conservatives are aiming for, or a no-deal Brexit, as it may be. So divorcing the UK from the EU is going to make it much more difficult for the EU to work as a force for good, for change in the world in terms of dealing with climate change. And of course, if we divorce from the EU, then we're going to be swapping the EU for that kind of a close relationship with the USA, if Owen has his way. And that's going to be absolutely dire for sectors like agriculture in North Shropshire as well. So we could talk about that and probably go on talking about it all night, but I think that would be the main issue.
Thank you. Now, is Chris Mackey here this evening? The question is that Brexit is not the only issue of concern in this election.
Good evening, panel, and thank you for coming this evening. I think you're all very brave to come here. My question is much more local. I'd like to know what your party policies are with regard to ensuring equitable funds distributed from government to councils, county councils, especially to address the difference between urban funding and rural funding. Shropshire is particularly hard hit.
And we'll hear from Owen Patterson from the Conservative Party first on this.
I'm just actually trying to get my researcher to find out the Shelter reference, actually, so if I can just finish saying the text. So we'll find out the exact reference. I've got a note here in my notes. Hang on, I'll read you the note, because I wasn't challenged about it. Well, we've got it here. Housing Charity Shelter says England needs 250,000 new homes annually to keep up with household formation. With 525,600 minutes in a year, that would mean one home every 2 minutes. Well, we'll just find out, if I can, where Shelter said 250,000. Sorry, now you're asking about local authorities.
That's about the housing crisis, not about immigration. It's to actually make that conflate those two facts is again typical, isn't it?
Anyway.
It's common sense. If you increase the population, you need more accommodation. You need more public services. It's pretty basic. If you increase the population by 250,000 a year, you're going to need more room for people. I didn't see anything difficult to understand about that.
Mr. Patterson, if you can address
You've had the opportunity
Mr. Mackey's.
to control immigration from the word go.
If you allow Mr. Patterson to answer Mr. Mackey's question that's just been put. So this is about funding for local authorities, particularly local authorities in rural areas.
Right, well this is one of my longest running, most vexed issues because when I first got in 1997, the Blair government brutally shifted money from the rural areas to the inner cities in a really flagrant manner. And we have a tiny number of MPs. I mean, I think the number of MPs, Tory MPs in my first parliament, was smaller than the Blair majority. So there's absolutely nothing we could do. And I did what I could. I remember once taking Ron Pugh, who was principal of Walford at the time, to see a nice Labour minister, a guy called Bill Rammell. I think came from Romford. He came from somewhere in Essex. And he was a nice guy. He was an education minister, explaining the problems that Walford had. And Bill Rammell and his senior officials simply could not believe there was a place like Walford where everybody arrived by private transport. There was no public transport in Walford at the time. They simply couldn't imagine the place existed. And I have had this constant battle for 22 years and will continue. It's not just local government, it's on education, it's on policing, it's on health. Trying to get across to urban officials and many ministers of all parties who work in London and just do not understand what it's like to deliver public services in a place like Shropshire. It is a constant battle. And we made some improvements. 20 years ago, F40 was created by 42 local authorities to really get across the problems of delivering good public services in rural areas. And there has been some improvement. Since there have been two big reviews, 2016, 2017, we came up with the national funding formula, which I think you can say has gone some way. There have been some improvements, but it still doesn't go far enough because the urban interests really fought back, particularly on the definition of deprivation, where they hung on to two criteria. So my case to you, I think it's a job, I can't see, so who was the questioner? It's a job half done. We made some improvements, and we made a good start, but it is still not good enough. And that will be one of the things I will be really working on. And actually, we haven't had the election. I had a meeting with Shropshire Council in, where are we now, October, and I was organising a meeting with the local government Secretary of State to go into the very real difficulties that Shropshire's got. So this is still out there. We've made some improvements. We've reeled it back some way from where we were after Labour, but it's still not good enough. And it'll be one of the things I'll be working on.
I'm going to hear from John Adams.
I don't see any reason why there should be a difference in funding per head between urban and rural areas. And we know at the moment only 5% of all taxes are raised at the local level. But the Green Party policy is to actually vastly increase the powers and responsibilities of local authorities. So we would reinstate funding for local councils so that decisions on spending can be made in terms of even local railways, buses, schools, so on, training needs in that particular area, because if we're going to transform the economy, we're going to have to transform industrial sectors as well. There's going to be need for a whole lot of training to be going on, and that should all be controlled by local authorities that know what the needs are in a particular area. We would also bring in a change to the way elections are held locally. To make it fairer, we'd bring in a proportional representation system at the local level as well. And of course, a big part of what would be happening locally is that we're planning to build these 100,000 zero carbon or very energy efficient social homes every year for the next 10 years. So there'll be an awful lot of training and skills work needed for that sort of transformation.
Helen Morgan, to answer the question, what are your party's policies to ensure equitable funding by central government for rural councils like Shropshire?
Well, our approach is quite similar to the Greens, really. We don't think that if you do everything from a top-down sort of authoritarian approach, that you're going to get the best solution, particularly for rural areas, because they, I mean, it's right, they get shouted out by the urban areas. So our policy is very much to devolve decision-making down to rural areas, but also tax-raising powers down to rural areas. Now, because each area has a different requirement, or each local region, whether they're urban or rural, or they have specific circumstances, there's no broad brush, one-size-fits-all answer to this question. But one of the examples we've got would be, for example, in a national park where there are high numbers of empty holiday homes, we'd give local councils the power to increase the council tax on those by 500%, for example. So that local areas could raise money locally for the projects that they need locally. So whether that's building houses or transport, all of those kind of local projects that you need to improve the infrastructure. So, like the Green Party, we think we should be devolving the power and some tax raising powers, obviously not all of them, down to the local area, and again giving local people a proper democratic way of electing their representatives, so that there's local accountability with what they decide to do.
Graeme, Currie, what's the Labour Party's position on this question?
I want to make a simple point here. Labour will reverse the austerity agenda that we've had for the last decade. And let's be clear about what that austerity agenda was about. A political opportunity was taken by the right wing of the Conservative Party to see that as an opportunity to dismantle local democracy and local government and local services. What we've seen over the last 10 years has been a denudement of local funding. We've seen, we've talked about the impact on health, but if we look at the impact on local government, we've seen, I've talked about the reduction of funding for education. We've seen something akin to a 25% year-on-year reduction of local authority budgets. And the impact of that has been the closure of a wide range of services. The Labour Party's policy is to reverse that trend of austerity, see local government as a key partner, because in a way, the Tories have gone back to something that some of the older ones amongst us here would remember as the Nicholas Ridley approach, which is local government is just something that meets every now and again to dish out the contracts to the private providers. Well, we need to change that model. We need to have it, and also we're going to review the business rate model, which has been a way of strangling local government and its funding approach. So what we need is a whole new relationship between central government and local government to give the powers back to local government to fund proper services and ensure that that money is provided. One of the examples as well that you see is, for example, in the last couple of years, there was £2 million was cut from Shropshire Council's public health budget. Previously, public health was within the NHS, and it moved to local government about 8 or 9 years ago, I think it was. And we thought it was going to be safe there, but actually it just became an option for cuts, and it went. So what we've got a situation, so it's just part of the reason that we've got 20% increases in demand in the A&E departments over the last 4 months. Literally, those are the figures we've got. Because we're not fixing the bridges, people are following the river, and they're having to get fished out of the river down the stream, because we're not putting the services in place, the prevention services, because local government has been denuded. So the Labour Party policy is to re-establish that balance, put services back, end the austerity agenda, which is a political project, not an economic project.
Thank you very much. We're going to close now. It's a very short break, and if anybody has questions, if they can pop them down on a piece of paper and maybe draw them to the attention of the people with the microphones. I'm very mindful of the fact that I do not have any questions from female voters. No women voters, so I would like to hear from some ladies, please. And then we'll just break for 5 minutes, and then we'll get through as many questions as we can. Mr. Patterson would just like to make one point in relation to one of the questions he was asked, and then we'll move on to some of the other great questions we've got.
Yes, thank you very much. Right, my search has come back. Shelter and KPMG published a report called Building the Homes We Need. And in that, there is a quote, total household growth is driven by the birth rate, net migration, and changes in the existing population, such as longer life expectancy and the divorce rate. And a little further on, changing demographics mean we need to build a minimum of 250,000 new homes per year in England to meet rising demand. So I repeat again, with 525,600 minutes in a year, that is one every 2 minutes. So, would the gentleman there please like to withdraw his comment that I was a racist? I quoted from a respected, highly respected, neutral charity. Which, it's one of the elements. It is one of the elements.
You're not listening.
Total growth household driven by birth rate, net migration.
Listen to what he says.
I think Mr. Patterson has clarified the point and the source of his...
Yeah, but I would like, look, I'm not prepared to sit here, some patsy, just because I got a blue rosette on, to have someone call me a racist. But I quote from a highly reputable report by one of the leading accountant organisations and a very respected, neutral, totally non-political charity. Okay, I'm not prepared to put up with it.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry.
Excuse
so will you please withdraw the comment?
Can I just clarify something?
No, you can't. Withdraw the comment.
We'll just give the gentleman in the audience his right to respond, and then we will move on to the next question.
You said that we want all those houses to accommodate people.
I did.
No,
I did not say that. I quoted the Shelter report saying with the increasing population, we need a new home every 2 minutes. I just quoted that from you. Gentleman at the back doubted there was such a report. I've now proved there was a report. No. And I'd like you to withdraw your comment that I'm a racist, because I'm not a racist.
Can I just clarify, please? Can I just clarify? You may not have meant it, but you only mentioned immigrants. When you read it...
No, we didn't. No, we did not.
Mr. Patterson has been given the opportunity to clarify the source, and the gentleman in the audience has made a comment, has also been given the right to reply. We will now move on to our next question.
I'd like to know if he still thinks I'm a racist. I'm sorry
Well,
about this.
we're not going to... We are now going to move on to one of the other questions.
I'm sorry. I know. I've been MP for 22 years. I respect all the constituents of North Shropshire, but I'm not prepared to come to a public meeting and to be treated like a patsy and told I'm a racist, because I'm not a racist, okay?
Yeah.
Very, very simple.
You need to remove him. You can't apologise, you're removing him.
Yep.
No, I will not be removing Mr. Patterson. What we will be doing now is moving on to the next question that comes from Nicky Lacey from Whitchurch.
No, I'm terribly sorry. I'd like to slightly quietly admit.
Well, maybe it's a conversation that the gentleman has been given the opportunity to have his say.
Can we please move on?
And let's please move on now to a question from Nicky Vasey from Whitchurch, and I also have an associated question from Mo Clegg. But first, if we hear from Nicky Vasey.
Hi. Owen Patterson's been MP for 22 years and in government for a decade. 1 in 5 people in Shropshire is hungry and food bank use is increasing. So I would like to know what the candidates will do to reduce poverty.
And in a related question from Mo Clegg, what is your party going to do about the increasing use of food banks? And we'll hear from Owen Patterson first on this question.
Well, as it happened, I went to the Whitchurch Food Bank yesterday, which I opened a few years ago, to see how they were progressing. And they are doing increasing business. They have... I'm just trying to find the exact figure. I've got these there. But this is a phenomenon across the Western world. there are 1.5 million people using food banks in Germany. There are 3.5 million using food banks in France. And those, there are about 28 families I saw getting food yesterday. And this is partly, and they were quite clear about this, this is to do with a change in society. There is societal breakdown. There are more divorces. No, I've had this directly from them yesterday, the people running the food bank. And there is no absolutely simple black and white solution. The answer is to have a more prosperous society and more people in work. And that we have done. We've got 1,000 people into work every single day since 2010. Let me just finish this. I'm trying to answer the question. The point I'm making is we need to create more wealth and to create more jobs. So we created the jobs, and what we are seeing now, quite interestingly, in the last couple of years, is an increase in real wages for the bottom 10% as opposed to the top 10%. And that is the way forward. The way forward is to increase wealth and to increase economic activity. There has always been, sadly, poverty in every society. There have always been people who find it difficult to manage their lives and manage their budgets. And if you can just let me finish the sentence. That is why we need to create more wealth so people are better paid. And we have managed to steady the economy. It has been growing at a regular rate. We were borrowing, I remind you of this, £300,000 a minute under the Labour government when we took over in 2010. It's taken some time to correct that. And now, at last, we have got it onto a solid foundation. We have created a very significant number of jobs. We've now got to ensure that those at the lower end of the income scale keep more of what they earn. So what Boris Johnson announced today is very good news, pushing up the NI threshold. But that is the only way out of this, is to have more people in jobs and those in jobs earning more money.
Can you explain
Graeme,
that?
Currie, and your about food banks.
Yeah, I just want to take the opportunity, because we weren't given the opportunity to make comments before about racism and MPs. I take the point that Owen gets upset that somebody calls him a racist, but let's look at the tone here. We've got a Prime Minister who talks about piccaninnies with watermelon smiles. We've got a Prime Minister who talks about Asian women looking like letterboxes. This is absolutely outrageous. We've got a political culture that was happy to weaponise racism and immigration in the Brexit debate. And that gentleman there picked up an example of it, really. Okay, the Labour Party proposals would be a living wage of £10 per hour for people over 16, eliminate in-work poverty in the course of the first Parliament would be a commitment within the manifesto. That's going to be in the manifesto tomorrow. Scrap universal credit and the punitive benefit system that is putting so many people to food banks and on the street. And absolutely right, many of the people that go to food banks, the evidence is that they are it's people in work poverty. The Labour Party will clamp down on problem debt by capping credit card and overdraft repayments so that borrowers never repay more than interest they originally borrowed. Expand free childcare, open 1,000 new Sure Start centres, tackle the productivity crisis to actually develop well-paid, productive jobs in our economy, set targets for the ending the need of food banks altogether within the first 3 years and halve food bank usage within the first year. That's going to be a manifesto commitment. End rough sleeping, ring-fence 8,000 homes for people with a history of rough sleeping and put 100 million to tackle immediate winter pressures. Protect pensioner incomes by guaranteeing the free TV licence, free bus passes and the winter fuel payments, and bring justice to women affected by the debacle of the state pension age manipulation. So the Labour Party manifesto that you're going to be produced tomorrow is going to have bang in the centre how it addresses the austerity agenda and the poverty that we've got. We've seen that report. The report's here. I'd like to show you the report that went, it's going to go to the council. Tackling food poverty together, Shropshire Food Poverty Alliance. 1 in 5 children in Shropshire lives in food poverty.
Rubbish.
And that's...
Rubbish.
Rubbish.
It's terrible.
I'd just like you to access this report then. If you don't believe it, I haven't written it, don't worry, it's not a political report. Age Concern, actually, Age UK, sorry, that are part of the filming here, were involved in this report. We've got a situation where we did a piece of research and we found that food bank uptake in the Oswestry Food Bank that I know has gone up, as I said, by actually 72% in the last 3 years. And it's absolutely heartbreaking. They've run out. I know a friend of mine was talking about how the hospitals on discharge from the maternity units are actually giving some families packs with, effectively food bank packs with nappies, maternity items, because the families can't afford it. This is not the type of society we need. We've got a society where gross inequalities of income and wealth, and the Labour Party will address it with a clear policy agenda that will be subject to targets, and that will be in the manifesto tomorrow.
Helen Morgan, what will the Lib Dems be doing to address poverty?
Well, I think that the food bank issue is quite specifically related to 1 or 2 policies over the last 5 years. One is this sort of bungled rollout of universal credit, but particularly the fact that when you get your universal credit, you have to wait 5 weeks for the first payment. And if you've got no money in the bank, you haven't got any money to buy food for the first 5 weeks. So that's a big driver. I think 1.5 million food parcels were issued in the beginning of March. So a lot of people are using food banks, and because they have these crisis cash flow moments. So the first thing that we would do is reduce that wait for the first payment from 5 weeks to 5 days, so that we don't have people taking out payday loans and struggling with the knock-on impact of that initial 5-day wait. But the overall credit system is too low. We know that. We've got a 2-child cap imposed by this government. And the rape clause, yes, somebody mentioned for me, that all needs removing, the caps and the rape clauses, because children don't have the choice of whether they have 2 older siblings or not. So those caps need to go. I think some people in the audience also mentioned in-work poverty. So we know that a lot of people going to food banks they have jobs, but they're not earning enough to be able to feed themselves, and that's because of the way that the universal credit is rolled out and the way that you lose your benefits very quickly once you start working. It's got 2 impacts. It's moving people too poor to afford food, but it also, because it phases off so quickly, it actually works as a disincentive to work, so the whole system is just broken on that universal credit. So we would be looking at increasing those lower income universal credits, removing the 2-child cap, and I've forgotten the number of billions that we're going to invest in the system to resolve these poverty issues. And there's all sorts of knock-on areas around transport, around housing as well.
John
and fuel
Adams.
poverty.
John Adams, what's the Green Party's position on this one?
Well, a big part of transforming society, the economy, will be reducing poverty, a big part of that. And the main policy that we have pledged in our manifesto is something called universal basic income. So all adult residents of the country between the ages of 18 and 65 would receive £89 a week as a basic income. And so what they earn on top of that is for them. So hopefully that would lift an awful lot of people out of a sort of poverty trap. If you're over 65, then you'd get £178 a week. And that would be inflation linked as well. There would also be additional payments for children. So for the first 2 children, you'd get an extra £70 a week each. And then additional children after that would be another £50 a week. If you're a single parent, you'd get another £25 a week. And so on. Similarly, if you're over 65. So all pensions and benefits would be replaced by this basic, universal basic income, aside from housing benefit and carers allowance, which would be on top of the universal income. Disability, also payments same as now, but we'd also put an extra £1.5 billion into disability payments. So overall, there should be more money for job seekers, more money for pensioners, more money for working families, and nobody on benefits should be any worse off as a result of it, most of them much better off. So the housing benefit and carers allowance would be, as I say, on top. If you get it now, you'd continue to get it as well. We're also going to abolish the bedroom tax. And the net cost of all of this rejigging is expected to be about £76 billion a year. And we'd also have free childcare as well, from 9 months up to the age of 4. And that would cost another £8 billion or so a year. So with the 1.5 disability supplement on top of that, the total amount comes to £85.5 billion a year. So it's a huge amount of investment there. And that's going to be funded by reforming the tax system, also scrapping Trident, nuclear submarines, and HS2 as well.
We're going to move on to another question now on an entirely different topic that was submitted by Bill Jones. Is Bill still here? Right at the front.
Hello, how are you? Basically what I want to talk about is what our friend Owen came up with, in that there are a couple of continents whose exports have been increasing very quickly. In fact, the one continent, Greenland, its exports of water were something like 200 billion tons of extra water going into the oceans every day. During the summer. And also, as a surprise, the Antarctic is also spewing out billions of tons of water every day.
The question
comes along.
Yeah.
And so these exports are rising exponentially, and so is the sea level rising exponentially. And unfortunately, there's about 600 million. I know it's coming now. There are 600 million people that live within only 2 foot of sea level. And considering that the sea level's already gone up 8 inches, those 2 feet are soon going to be eaten into. So the question is, are we moving anything like fast enough when we're talking about zero carbon by 2030?
The question you submitted to me is this: do the candidates agree that 2030 is the correct target date for climate change action? And I'm going to come to the Green Party first on this one.
Well, everybody kind of knows how difficult it's going to be to achieve net zero carbon by 2030. It's an absolutely monumental task, and there's no guarantee that we could even succeed in doing it. But more recent information is that we could actually pass the 1.5 degree C limit that the world's governments agreed to try and keep below if we're going to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And we could even be going through that limit by 2030. So you could say, no, we're not going fast enough, but it's an absolutely monumental job to get anywhere near that. And as long as we can kind of restore the energy balance of the Earth system within the next, well, by the end of the century, for example, to bring the atmospheric carbon dioxide levels down to something like, well, even above pre-industrial, but low enough so that the problem is, you know, not too unmanageable. So there are different ways of trying to arrange that by having not just a percentage emission reduction every year, but combining different levels of emission reduction every year with other methods of taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And there have been estimates that maybe 100 or 150 gigatons of carbon could, during the course of this century, be removed from the atmosphere. And that's the sort of scale of what we'd have to do. But even if we were starting next year, we probably have to reduce our emissions by something like 6 or more % a year and start drawing down carbon by using extensive tree planting, afforestation, and also...
We have reduced carbon emissions. We've closed 18 power stations in the UK, but I'm ex-power station worker. We've reduced the carbon emissions. Do you know what carbon capture is? The only idea what carbon, it's a way of filtering carbon out of the system. Germany...
Right, well, there is no scale development of it.
Germany to date, I've had an issue, inquiry through for a tender, are building 3 brand new coal-fired stations in Germany to date. This is your carbon emissions.
Yeah, Germany have a problem, don't they? But
yeah,
find a balance between
we don't.
fossil
We've closed
fuels
18 power stations
nuclear.
in the UK. We've got 2 coal-fired stations left, and they're going to be closed. Drax and Edinburgh.
Good.
Yeah.
So you've got it all wrong. Carbon emissions, we've done our bit. It's the Chinas of the world.
No, I'm
really?
sorry.
I'm going to bring Graeme Currie and Graeme on this point. Is 2030 the correct target date?
I feel kind of guilty leaving you hanging on that one, because that's clearly not where we're at. That's clearly not where we're at. We've got to be in a situation where we recognise that this is an existential threat. That's the new phrase we've all come into terms with, isn't it? As a baby boomer, I've spent my life not thinking this is a problem, thinking my old dad was chasing me around, making me turn the light off and all these. The reality is, we're in a situation where the climate emergency is now unchallengeable. I'd be very interested in, given that we've got a panel here that includes a Member of Parliament who's been a Member of Parliament for 22, 23 years, has also been a Secretary of State for the Environment, and I've sat through 2 sets of hustings with him already, and I've heard him make arguments that climate change is just one of them things that happens, that you can get an ice edge every now and again and it's nothing to worry about. I'd be very interested in what the view of our Member of Parliament is in terms of climate change. Clearly the Labour Party is saying this election is as much about the climate emergency as it is about anything else. If this election is about ending austerity, if it's about Brexit, if it's about how do we revitalise the economy, it's as much about the climate emergency, probably as a centrepiece of this election. The Labour Party has committed itself to a very ambitious plan of carbon and being net carbon neutral by 2030. This is an extremely ambitious plan. The Labour manifesto tomorrow will look at how we implement that. We're talking about kickstarting a green revolution. We're talking about a wholesale, certainly banning fracking, not suspending it like the current government are doing. Investing in green energy with hundreds of thousands of jobs, working towards that target and making the commitment. It's going to be difficult. But the current target of 2050, if we set our target at 2030, and that's what that's the Labour Party's committing itself to do, it's not going to be something that we can. The world needs that solution, and that's the Labour Party policy. We're going to aim to 2030 for net carbon emissions.
We'll hear straight away from Owen Patterson on those points.
We'll hear what I think. Can I very quickly pick up a point on the previous question, which I think does need correcting? Helen talked about universal credit. She's quite right. The payments don't start for 5 weeks, but a loan is available. And the whole point about universal credit is treating people who are unemployed exactly as if they were employed, so they manage their own budgets. And what was very clear yesterday at the food bank, bluntly, is that some people find it very, very difficult to manage their budgets. And that is one thing I think we need to look at, is how we can help people manage the loan. It literally means more domestic economics, all that sort of thing, teaching. But it would be completely tragic, to pick up Graham's point, to abandon universal credit. I remember so often in my early years talking to people who were in employment and they wanted to go over a certain number of hours and they went off a cliff. They lost 3, 4, 5 benefits and they got hit by a 97.5% rate of tax, so they didn't work.
Chair, are we all going to get second bites on these questions? I'm happy to have a second bite on your question, your answer.
And staff in the job centres are really keen on keeping it going.
No.
Right, okay, on climate change.
On to the question.
Look, it is happening, obviously, but it's not happening at the speed.
Yes, it is.
It is not.
It really is.
The IPCC, which is the absolute ultimate world body, has made forecasts, and warming has not matched those forecasts. I'm afraid that is a fact. The IPCC said in 1990 we would get a 1% increase by 2025, up to 2017, depending whether you're looking at satellite or whatever the measurement is, it's 0.3 or 0.49. So it is not the emergency and the catastrophe that everyone is talking about. It is a problem which needs measured, sensible approach. And the gentleman at the back is absolutely right. It is completely pointless closing down industries in this country, like, for instance, the aluminium smelter up in Armagh, where, as everyone knows, aluminium, you have to stick a very large charge of electricity through bauxite. That has gone, making 550 people in Northumberland redundant. The plant has been moved back to Canada, and the world is getting exactly the same amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So we've got, and we only produce 1% of world emissions. We've actually done very well because we've switched from coal to natural gas, and that means we've actually greatly reduced our emissions. The next step is that we've got to go after technology. The way out of this, and I personally think 2030 is not manageable. We've set a very ambitious target of 2050. But to do that, we are going to have to really drive on new technologies like fusion and hydrogen. And that's the future. And we should remember, as the gentleman said at the back, when I was in East Germany not long ago, you know, they are building these hideous new coal plants. They're not coal, they're lignite. And I remember travelling in East Germany, that filthy, dirty stench of brown, thick, sulphury smoke. That's really horrible stuff. And you look at China. China is currently building, in its plans, the same capacity in coal as the whole of Europe's current coal capacity. So we've got to be very careful that we don't arbitrarily close down our own industry to give ourselves a warm feeling. That will not help the world, and it will not help the most disadvantaged people in our society who need a booming economy. So my very clear view is there are some technologies available now, and just one example, I gave a speech about this 3 or 4 years ago now, would be mini-nuclear. We've had mini-nuclear plants working for some time, and we have massively missed the opportunity on combined heat and power. The last Labour government were really naughty, they didn't push this. Combined heat and power means you, instead, at the moment, about 50% of the heat of a nuclear power station goes up the chimney, or any power station. Combined heat and power means you can capture 92%. So if you look at somewhere, 2 examples would be Freiburg in Germany or Massachusetts. Combined heat and power has delivered massive gains. It is far more efficient. We could do that now with a range of mini nukes, which we could station around the country. You could greatly reduce the cost of production if we reduced them in series. Against that, we're talking about huge nuclear plants. We have Hinkley C, which is being built. It is massively expensive, but what's alarming for me is that it's 2 sister plants, which are much further advanced, Flamanville and Olkiluoto in Finland, are not yet working, and they are struggling to make that technology work. And even if we did get that to work, we'd have to build one of those every 4 months. And that's what we're up against. We're talking about almost fantasy, this stuff, about 2030. We need to really drive on very, very radical new technology like fusion if we are to get there. And that should be what we're doing. We have to get out of this through technology and innovation, exactly as we got out of the food crisis in the 1960s. For me, the greatest hero of the 20th century was a plant scientist called Norman Borlaug. Because we had a guy called Ehrlich, who is still preaching doom and gloom, saying the battle to feed the world was lost. He said by the end of the 1970s, hundreds of thousands to millions of people would die of famine. We couldn't save them. Borlaug came along with his new strains of wheat, and by the end of the 70s, places like India and Pakistan. Well, I remember as a child, terrible pictures of famine on the telly. Mexico became net exporters. So we got out of that one with technology, and we will get out of this problem with technology. That's the way to go.
Helen Morgan, with
I think the question was 2030 soon enough? And I think the honest answer to that is, in an ideal world, no. But the reality is, it's very soon. Most of us here probably came by car this evening because we don't have a proper public transport infrastructure. We don't have electric cars widely available, and those are all the things we need to work towards. So we think that 2030 is probably unachievable, and so our target is 2045, and that's supported by the International Fund for Nature, for example. So it's not wildly off. I think we have to be idealistic about the climate emergency, but we also have to be practical. So if we're going to get out of it, we do need to invest in new technologies. Now, one of our key achievements in Coalition actually was setting up the Green Investment Bank to get green technologies funded properly, and we put in a certain amount of government funding, and then that was trebled by the private sector, and we were incredibly successful in building offshore wind farms, for example. So we have one of the leading offshore wind industries in the world, and that's been privatised now by the Conservatives. So one of our key policies is to bring back that green investment bank and invest in the technologies we need. Now, Owen mentioned fusion. I don't think anywhere in the world has achieved that yet. I think fusion has been the fuel of the future since I was a little girl. So it would be lovely, but I'm not sure that that's credible. So we need to invest in renewable energy here. Clearly, with any utility, you have capacity issues. There are days in this country where the wind doesn't blow and it isn't sunny. And those are difficult to get over with utilities. And that's why we should be investing in things like tidal power, which aren't dependent on the weather and can help to give us some capacity. So we, for example, would immediately allow the Swansea Bay Tidal project to go ahead. But the reality is, because of this capacity issue, and because some of the technologies that we've talked about aren't easily turn off and onable, and our electricity demand is low in the night time and very high at this time of night, the reality is we're always probably going to need to have some gas-fired stations, so we need to offset those emissions. And that's why we've got this extremely ambitious tree planting programme to try and suck some of that carbon back out of the atmosphere in order to offset what we'll probably need for shaping. So I think in an ideal world, 2030 isn't soon enough, but we have to be realistic about what we've got and where we've got to get to. So we think 2045 is the right target.
Thank you very much indeed. Now I'm keeping a close eye on the time. It's now 9:45, and my understanding is that we have to be out of the building by 9.
We can run a little bit longer now.
Okay. Okay, one more question, and in which case I will ask the candidates to be as short and to the point as they can. And it's a question. Andy is still here, right at the from the front row to the right to the back row.
Thank you. Hi. So I have a question for the whole panel, although I would be interested to know Mr. Patterson's thoughts on this specifically. I would like to know your stance on LGBT inclusive education and sex education in schools. The reason I'm quite interested in Mr. Patterson's stance on this is because recently as in this year, July 2019, you voted against the right to gay marriage in Northern Ireland. So I was just wondering on your stance on that.
In which case we'll go along the panel in this direction.
Yes, I voted against that because I believe that was an issue which should have been left to the devolved assembly. So we can't constantly say we admire the evolution, we've given you the power, and then arbitrarily overrule them from Westminster. That's the reason I voted against that. Sorry, the first part of the question was what?
Your thoughts on LGBT inclusive education, as there's been quite an uproar about it recently.
Yeah. The question is, what is the panel stance on LGBT inclusion sex education within schools in Shropshire?
Well, I think that's got to be handled by individual schools and by the head teachers and the staff. Because it depends who the pupils are, what circumstances are. And I would rely on the common sense of our teachers in Shropshire to take a sensible line.
As long as the message is age appropriate and our teachers are skilled enough to ensure that it is, then I'm perfectly happy for it to be included.
Yeah, the Green Party would have mandatory equality and diversity training in schools, so that would be something that everybody would benefit from.
Helen talked about some key achievement, with the conversation about key achievements of the Tory Lib Dem coalition government, and I guess one of the key achievements was single-sex marriage bill. Some of the other key achievements were austerity Britain, tuition fees, and breaking Britain through the austerity agenda. In terms of the LGBT education in schools, I agree. Age appropriate, it's got to be handled sensitively within the schools, and it's equality and diversity issue that is perfectly appropriate in modern Britain that needs to be addressed. I support it.
Thank you, everybody. I think that will be the last question for tonight. I'd like to thank everybody really for coming this evening on a cold, dark, late November evening. This election has been described as the most volatile, possibly the most unpredictable in a long time. Certainly we've had some great debate tonight. I'd like to thank the organisers, thank the candidates, because without the candidates coming and being prepared to answer questions directly, these sorts of events couldn't happen. I'd like to thank you as well, because obviously it'll be your verdict in a few weeks' time that is the most important of all. So thank you very much, everyone.